Hello, good afternoon, good morning. My name is Hillary Stevens. I work with Restore America's Estuaries, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar series. Our webinar today is called Overcoming Permitting Barriers to Unlock Coastal Resilience. We have a fantastic lineup here today that we're very excited to bring you. And I won't belabor that, but just a few introductory points here. First of all, this is in webinar mode, so all of the attendees are muted. If you have any questions for any of our speakers, please feel free to use the Q&A or the chat function to enter those. We will be running for an hour and taking a few questions at the end as we have time. The speakers may be able to address those in writing during the session, but please do hang on at the end for question and answer. I want to make sure to remind you all, we have an event coming up in October in Galveston, Texas. The Living Shorelines Tech Transfer Workshop will be on October 24th and 25th in Galveston, and will include lots of workshops and speakers, as well as field trips to some sites there in Texas to see some of the great work being done in that region. So please do put that on your calendar and stay posted. Watch our newsletters for more information. With that, I'm going to get right into things, and I'm going to hand the microphone over first to Sylvia Troost of Pew, who is a co-host for this event, and she can talk more about the report that we'll be hearing about and the folks presenting it. So Sylvia.
Thank you. And first off, thank you to Hillary Stevens and Rob Shane and all the folks at Restore America's Estuaries for hosting this webinar. So my name is Sylvia Troost. I work for the Pew Charitable Trust on efforts to advance research, evidence-based policy, and funding to conserve, restore, and build resilience in coastal and nearshore habitats. These habitats, which are the focus of the research and practices you're about to hear about, provide myriad benefits for people and nature, including supporting commercial and recreational fisheries, improving water quality, and protecting communities from storms. Unfortunately, here in the US, these habitats are at a fraction of historic levels, and we do continue to lose them. So to better understand the policy environment governing management of these coastal habitats, which include, for the purposes of this report, salt marsh, oyster reef, and seagrass beds, Pew Charitable Trust partnered with Duke University to look at the policy frameworks, challenges, and opportunities for conservation and restoration with a deeper dive in 6 states. So today you'll hear about the findings of this research, as well as on-the-ground experiences in North Carolina and Washington. So with that, I will turn the webinar over to our main speakers, starting with Rachel. Thank you.
Thanks, Sylvia. And thank you, Hillary, for the introduction, and the whole team at Restore America's Estuaries for organizing this webinar series. My name is Rachel Karasik, and I'm a Senior Policy Associate at Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability. And I'm the lead author of the report, State of the Coast, a review of coastal management policies for 6 states, which Sylvia just introduced. I will speak very briefly and at a very, very high level for just a few minutes about the report and some of its findings. And this will tee us up for a deeper dive from practitioners in North Carolina and Washington on how state policy and coordination with federal agencies can help overcome some of the permitting barriers we identified as they relate to coastal restoration. Next slide, please. For our study, we looked at 6 coastal US states. As you can see here, those are Massachusetts, North Carolina, Florida, Texas, California, and Washington. We didn't choose these states because we have any sort of personal preference for them, but we did want a set of states that can help demonstrate diversity, both in terms of state politics, as well as the policy frameworks that guide and oversee coastal habitats. There's a huge diversity in terms of how and the extent to which states employ centralized and decentralized frameworks with respect to both local decision-making and cooperative federalism that we wanted to capture in our analysis. Next slide, please. And we also looked at 4 distinct habitat types, again, as Sylvia mentioned earlier. So we looked at oyster reefs or beds, mangroves, seagrass, and salt marsh, all very beautiful, valuable habitats, as you can see here. Next slide, please. Our research questions were sort of shown in this slide here. For the habitats and within the states, we sought to understand what is the habitat status and the threats to those habitats. What is the patchwork of policies that govern coastal habitat protection and restoration, and to also identify to what extent these policy and policy frameworks work and what data we have on policy effectiveness. Next slide, please. In terms of our methods, and sorry for the tiny text here, but we did use comprehensive, though non-exhaustive, secondary literature and policy document review methods that we worked with research librarians to iterate on. And we also held dozens of interviews across all 6 states with different practitioners and stakeholder representatives. And by doing that, we were able to determine status and threats to the habitats in each state, identify and characterize the policy landscape, determine policy effectiveness, and clarify any ongoing or emerging barriers to moving forward coastal habitat protection and restoration on the state level. And I will now quickly go through these high-level findings. Next slide, please. So we found that globally and across the US, most of these habitats have been declining in area for decades. I suspect that is not news for most of you on this webinar, and often centuries too in terms of the area decline. However, though we know this, there was limited up-to-date data that enables kind of the measurement of habitat loss on national and state levels, and that prohibits the comparison of loss across states and across nations over time in a uniform way. We did find the threats to coastal habitats across 6 states and across the habitats to be fairly uniform. And we were not able to determine a single threat that could be identified as the most critical, given the sort of synergistic effects of these threats on habitat health. We broadly categorize the threats that we reviewed and found through our research as current and historical physical alteration of the habitat, so impacts from dredge and fill, prop scarring, and overharvesting that has a lot of habitat interaction. The next one was coastal development and shoreline hardening. The next were changes to water quality, often from kind of upstream sources, but these include salinity changes, water pollution, especially nutrient pollution, and changes in turbidity or sedimentation. And the last one being stressors related to climate change. So these are sea level rise, also salinity changes, and increased intensity and frequency of storms, as well as ocean acidification. These are obviously all overlapping threats, and this is just one way that we can think about categorizing them. Next slide, please. In terms of the policy landscape, it is really complicated. By qualitatively coding hundreds of policy documents, we found very few policies that focused on those specific habitats that we included in our study. So salt marsh, seagrass, oysters, and mangroves. Often policies looked at coastal habitats or regions broadly, or if they did focus on one of those habitats, they focused on them in a very narrow way. For example, banning boats in seagrass habitat to prevent prop scarring. So coastal habitat policy frameworks broadly, so sort of the regime of coastal habitat policy across different jurisdictions vary tremendously. So federal, state, and local governments sometimes have overlapping authority, roles, and responsibilities. And this is complicated by the fact that some coastal habitat areas are owned and managed under private property, and that there are also competing interests for coastal habitat, including property development and natural resource use. And this is even further complicated by cross-jurisdictional or regional efforts to protect and oversee coastal habitat, which involve multiple states and in some cases countries, including Canada and Mexico. And so that also sort of brings in additional overlapping and competing roles, responsibilities, and authorities for addressing coastal habitat. Next slide, please. In terms of policy effectiveness, which is the data that people are often hoping to find, we found very, very limited literature that looked at the state level policy effectiveness on achieving any number of coastal habitat protection or restoration outcomes or other social and economic outcomes. And we found no studies that used causal methods, so methods that would be able to demonstrate that the actual implementation of a policy had an effect on policy, on habitat quality or health outcomes. We did find a number of articles on the implementation of the Clean Water Act or Coastal Zone Management Act as it's implemented at the local level with varying degrees of effectiveness depending on kind of innovative methods of implementation. But characterizing these in some ways fell largely outside of the scope of the study, which aimed to look at state level policy. Next slide, please. I think this won't be surprising to most of you in the audience, but we also were able to identify a number of barriers to achieving effective coastal habitat protection and restoration via the existing policy landscape. So these include a lack of monitoring coupled with few measurable and science-based benchmarks that can support monitoring of restoration interventions and outcomes. Another was the limited authorities that coastal managers have to address some of the threats to coastal habitat health. These include climate change, which leads to sea level rise and ocean acidification, as well as upstream water quality. So that's largely outside of the authorities of coastal managers. The other finding we had is that permits are often granted for coastal development projects or other projects that might have negative impacts on habitat health without considering cumulative impacts of other nearby projects or other stressors to the system. And the last main barrier and the main reason that we are here today is the limitations that we heard from coastal managers and other stakeholder groups that are practitioners of coastal restoration that are trying to access the very permits that were designed and intended to protect coastal habitat in the first place. And so the sort of bureaucratic funding capacity and resources that were required to achieve these permits were seen as a barrier for actually being able to implement restoration projects on the ground. Next slide, please. Permitting barriers that delay environmental projects have been a hot topic recently. I think those of us who are watching what's happening on the federal government, we're seeing that historic funds are now available for long-awaited projects dealing with, coastal restoration, environmental restoration, and other environmental projects. And so here are just a few examples of the mentions of some of these barriers in the news. Some of them are related to kind of delayed and ongoing restoration projects due to trouble getting permits. And then some have to do with energy permitting that has been a hot topic in the debt ceiling discussions that were recently resolved. Next slide, please. We did find a few bright spots in terms of innovative approaches on state and local levels to try to overcome some of these permitting and other barriers. So we saw both in the Houston Ship Channel and the San Francisco Bay, processes have been initiated to enable the use of dredged material for restoration with as much green tape or regulatory barriers, and to make sure that the efficiency of using dredged material is expedited. And we also found 2 state level policies within our sample of 6 policies that specifically address permitting challenges to coastal habitat protection and restoration. And these are the topics of the next presentation. So without further ado, next slide, please. Sorry. I'd like to quickly introduce the next set of speakers. I think Hillary will also give them an introduction as well, but we'll be hearing from Diane Hennessy, April Gassman and Todd Miller about these policies in North Carolina and Washington. Sorry, Gina Piazza, not April Gassman, including their development, implementation, lessons learned, and emerging challenges. And if you'd like to chat with me about our report and our findings, you can see my email below. So I will stop there. Thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And Gina, would you like to queue up?
Hi, thanks again for inviting myself and Diane here today to talk about our programs in Washington State. My name is Gina Piazza, and I've been a biologist with the Department of Fish and Wildlife for 15 years. And today I'll be presenting on the relatively new habitat recovery pilot program. Next slide. So first I'll provide an overview of the program, some history and key legislative context, and then I'll describe how a project can qualify for review under this program. And then I'll go over the application and review process and finally give a brief update on projects and lessons learned. Next slide. The HRPP is a new multi-agency effort to streamline local and state permitting processes for restoration projects that directly benefit fish and their habitats. This became effective July of 2021 and will be a pilot program for 4 years. The law governing this program is codified in RCW 7755-480. This law is under WFW's existing hydraulic authority, that is to ensure proper protections of fish life and fish habitat with a construction permit for projects that will use, divert, obstruct, or change the natural flow or bed of waters of the state. This permit is called a hydraulic project approval, or HPA. But first, how did the HRPP program come to be? Next slide. We'll start with an already established streamlining process in Washington called the Fish Habitat Enhancement Project. In 1998, there was recognition from our legislators and the Department of Fish and Wildlife that there are projects out there for the public good and also for fish and their habitat. It was agreed that there should be a streamlined effort and that restoration projects should have less hurdles. So the FHEP process was adopted. Next slide. The FHEP process exempts projects from the State Environmental Policy Act as well as local permits. The Department of Fish and Wildlife's HPA permit is still required. The FHEP streamlining process, however, is restricted to 4 project types, and only one of those being located in the marine environment. To qualify with a project in the marine environment, the project intent may only be to restore native kelp, eelgrass beds, or native oysters. Because the FHEP process was not comprehensive enough, next slide. A group of representatives from various state agencies who long recognized streamlining could be improved for restoration projects helped develop House Bill 1382. This bill also followed a recommendation from the Southern Resident Orca Task Force. House Bill 1382 was passed with the intent to promote and implement restoration projects that contribute to the recovery of watersheds throughout the state. Further, with this bill, the legislature hoped to advance construction as quickly and efficiently as possible, in turn creating jobs and improving the pace of salmon recovery. Next slide. The HRPP program is a product of House Bill 1382 and is in effect an expansion of the FHEP streamlining process. HRPP has no limit on project types, so opportunities for streamlining are expanded and can encompass marine shoreline projects such as armor removal or estuary restoration. In addition to SEPA and local permits, the HRPP also exempts state permits except those minimally necessary for participation in a federal program. HRPP does not exempt an applicant from federal permitting requirements. Also unique to the HRPP was the creation of a multi-agency permitting team, or we're calling a MAP team. Next slide. The original authors of the bill, as well as legislators involved, recognized that a team approach to permitting had worked well in the past. So as part of the legislation, a MAP team was created to help cooperatively navigate the new process. The MAP team consists of representatives from 6 Washington agencies. This team meets twice monthly to discuss program and project updates, activities, and questions. Next slide. So there are 5 components outlined in statute that a project must meet to qualify for review. Next slide. First, a project must directly benefit freshwater, estuarine, marine fish, or their habitat they rely on. Next slide. Second, a project must be reviewed, approved, or funded by one of 13 established restoration programs. Next slide. Third, the project must document consistency with local, state, and federal flood risk reduction requirements. Next slide. Fourth, a proponent must seek review by the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation and affected federally recognized tribes. Next slide. And fifth and finally, for projects which occur on state-owned aquatic land, an applicant must apply to DNR for land use authorization. Next slide. Next, to apply for a permit under the HRPP, the proponent must use WDFW's existing online permitting system and include complete plans and specs, as well as a supplemental application form. At the same time of application to WDFW, the applicant must also send a copy to the local government, MAP team members, and affected federally recognized tribes. Next slide. There is a 25-day review period for those notified to raise a concern regarding impacts to public safety, human health, or the environment. If any concerns are raised, a MAP team meeting is convened to review the concern and potential solutions. Following the 25-day comment period, the remaining 20 days are used by the assigned WDFW habitat bio to review, approve, or deny the permit. Next slide. As of today, we have 18 projects that have been applied for and 12 permitted under this new program. 4 of the permitted projects are located on the marine shoreline to include removal of bulkheads, excavation of tidal channels, beach nourishment, and installation of native plants. Next slide. Because HRPP projects required change with internal and external processes, we may have initially underestimated the amount of outreach needed. While WDFW staff, local government, and applicants were invited to informal webinars, perhaps more one-on-one time may have served for quicker acceptance to the program and the changes required. We've also learned that outreach needs to be ongoing due to staff turnover. Other lessons learned are that coordinating with external agency staff on a biweekly basis in the MAP team has been instrumental in assisting applicants achieve more efficient permitting for their restoration projects. In addition, for the projects that overlap with federal jurisdictions, myself and the MAP team work with the multi-agency review team, or the MART, to further support projects through these intersecting programs. The MART team is led by Diane Hennessy at EPA, and she'll be discussing this program next. Next slide. So please reach out if you have any additional questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Gina. Now, Diane, are you able to queue up?
Hello. I may not be able to do video.
That's fine. We can hear you loud and clear, so go right ahead.
Okay. All right. If you could queue up the slides, that'd be great. Thank you. Hello, my name's Diane Hennessy, and I'm with the Environmental Protection Agency, and I wear many hats there, but I'm working in their water division and specifically their Puget Sound recovery program. And we, as Gina had talked about, there's a multi-agency regulatory review team that was formed of federal and state agencies, and I'll be talking about that today. Next slide. And the main thing that brought that group together was because they wanted to figure out how to remove the barriers to getting more restoration on the ground, specifically in coastal areas to start with, and now they're broadening that. We're broadening that. Next slide, please. So the MART is a group of federal and state agencies, and it has a very similar model to what you just heard about for the Habitat Recovery Pilot Program. We are actually a subcommittee of what's called the Puget Sound Federal Leadership Task Force, which was just recently put together under legislation, but it had existed under an MOU since 2016, and that's a group of 17 federal agencies that have been working on recovery of Puget Sound and all the basins that contribute to it. So quite a large area. We started out the MART in a pilot, as I said, working on coastal projects. And the whole idea was to try to streamline the permitting process, remove any of the barriers that we had found. And we realized that as we went through that, that the federal permitting process is really probably the most complex. So we were focusing on improvements there, but we were doing that within the context of the whole of the entire permitting process. So next slide. This is the team. So EPA, which I'm the facilitator, and the Army Corps of Engineers, NOAA, or National Marine Fisheries Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and FEMA, who works on the floodplain management. And then our state partners are WWW, Washington State Department of Ecology, and Puget Sound Partnership. And I just wanted to call out that April Gassman is here from Puget Sound Partnership and can answer any questions today as well. She's been working with us with both the HRPP and us together, and the MART as well. So the partnerships that we formed, we work very closely with HRPP. And we also work with an organization called Shore Friendly, which is actually out on the ground talking to landowners along the coast, trying to work with them on sort of living coastline, living shoreline designs, and instead of using any kind of bulkhead. So the idea is to take bulkheads out. And then we, on an as needed basis, depending on where we are, we also work with the local jurisdictions. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So I know that this is very difficult to read, and I apologize for that. The intent is more to just show you what a map of the permitting system looks like. This is the conventional permitting system. So on the left, you can see that the applicants have a set of things that they need to submit for their permits. So they often just go in a stepwise fashion. They'll come in and go to the local jurisdiction and say, okay, I need a SEPA determination, State Environmental Policy Act determination, and then they have to have that before they can before any of the other agencies like WDFW needs actually a SEPA before they could actually issue their HPA. Now this is under the conventional pathway, not the HRPP. And the same with the Department of Ecology. They would be working with them on a shoreline permit. And then as the applicant kind of gets through the local and state process, then they move on to the federal process, going to the Corps of Engineers. Corps of Engineers, in order to comply with the Clean Water Act, they also need to get Endangered Species Act compliance and the Cultural Resources compliance, or that Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation Act compliance. And so they spend a lot of time coordinating with we call them the services, National Marine Fisheries Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then they also have to coordinate with the State Department of Ecology, if they plan to do an individual Clean Water Act Section 401 or a water quality certification, all in order to just get to their permit, which could be a nationwide permit or an individual permit. What the MART has done is basically tried to streamline this entire process by eliminating most of the local jurisdictions regulations through partnering with the HRPP, but then basically having all of these agencies at the table right from the beginning of the permitting of a project, so then they can walk through this process together and concurrently. So basically you get this vertical integration and no siloing, so you're not actually going in a stepwise fashion. So next slide, please. So just a quick overview, that how does working with the MART differ from a conventional process? One is we bring all those agencies together, like I said, and we actually have this team approach, facilitated team approach. And so what we actually do is we work with the applicants all the way from the beginning of the permitting process, and we navigate through the whole process until they actually get their permits at the end. One of the key things is connecting them with something like the Habitat Recovery Pilot Program, which is an existing or emerging expedited permit pathway, and the variety of other things like programmatics that the National Marine Fisheries Service or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have. And then next slide, please. So one of the ways that we actually work on all levels, so the local, state, and federal level, these are the typical permits that need to be done. Next slide, please. And one of the things that we've been doing in particular to coordinate and hopefully streamline the process more for the Habitat Recovery Pilot Program is to work on getting the cultural resources assessment done and that permit complete, so that then the applicants can move to getting their HPA, and then also helping with FEMA connecting to the local agencies, which has been a very difficult process and very lengthy, depending on what has been going on, not so much necessarily on the coastlines, but in more floodplain areas, to get that started and moved along. And those need to get started before you can also get your HPA under the Habitat Recovery Pilot Program. Next slide, please. So, the MART provides this direct and early access to a coordinated team of federal, state, and local permitting agencies. We provide this clear pathway to the permit requirements. We actually meet with all the agencies in a pre-application and then pre-application meeting, and then we actually follow that up with the permit requirements and actually links to where you can get those permits and any information that we might have gleaned from the pre-application meeting. And then the projects that are tagged under the MARC are basically prioritized by the permitting agencies. And then we just track the projects and adaptively resolve issues that arise. Next slide, please. Some of the benefits of participating have been potential reduction in permit process time, particularly for projects where cultural resources were not found within the project area. For a few of our projects, we've actually had processing time of about 30% less than average. And we can help the applicants with the process of completing their pre-qualifications that Gina talked about for the Habitat Recovery Pilot Program. Next slide, please. So some of the feedback we've gotten is that those pre-application meetings with all the agencies and then regular communication on a monthly basis between the applicants and the MART has been very beneficial. We've provided a clear understanding of the required permits, application materials, and overall permit process instead of the black box that you sort of put your permit application into and hope for the best. And one of our applicants had said that they had gone through the fastest and smoothest federal permit process of all the projects they'd worked on to date, and they had done many. Next slide, please. So I just want to give a project example. This is actually in northern Puget Sound at Deception Pass State Park. There's a bulkhead that you can see there, and the lower picture is where was that was removed and the areas were replanted. But basically this project happened before the HRPP occurred. So they did have to apply for all the local jurisdiction permits. Just to get the first permit, which is that SEPA permit, it took 5 months for the local jurisdiction to get their permit in, and then an additional at least 3 months to get the additional permits. And then for the state, in order to issue its permit, because it was being held up by SEPA, it took about 8 months or so. But because we started the federal permits at the same time, and there wasn't a cultural resources issue at this site, we actually were able to get all the federal permits, including ESA compliance and cultural resource compliance, in 4 months. So there's I think this really speaks to some of the streamlining and the efficiencies of that new legislation, the Habitat Recovery Pilot Program in Washington State. Next slide, please. So some of the lessons that we learned is that really early engagement with all the agencies, local, state, and federal, can really save on redundancy and improve interagency communications. We've also, the agency team can really troubleshoot the issues that come up on a monthly basis and move through those issues as they come up, and you actually have someone to talk to. So navigating that entire permitting system has been something that's been helpful for both people that are hardly done permitting to those that have had a lot of experience. Everyone's learned a lot of things, and really just having a dedicated team of agency members has been key to keeping this going. We have not found funding for everyone, but there is a lot of commitment from all the agencies that I listed. And we are on this continuous improvement and feedback loop that's part of our process, and then accountability for those agencies on a monthly basis. And next slide, please. And that's all I had for you today. So if you have more questions about the MART, please contact me at this email.
Thank you so much, Diane. That was terrific. And our final speaker today is Todd Miller from the North Carolina Coastal Federation. Todd, are you up?
I'm ready.
Great.
As soon as Rob gets the slides up. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the experiences we've had in North Carolina over the past 2 decades to try to overcome permit barriers. Next slide. As it already has been said, most of the environmental laws, policies, and rules that we have, both on a federal and state level, were really put in place to regulate development and pollution activities. And now they're being applied to more and more restoration and resiliency type projects that were not really even considered at the time that these programs were promulgated. Next. And trying to do that leads to a host of issues that we're very unclear roadmap sometimes in terms of what is really expected of individual projects. There's a lot left to discretion because the use standards and policies have not been well thought through. Next. On top of that, as we all know, there's both nationally and in many states, there's a huge push now to use more nature-based strategies to enhance coastal resilience and coastal ecosystems. And that's being fueled not only through policy, but through a lot of funding. Next. Yeah. And, different techniques such as living shorelines, which I'm going to talk primarily about, have been really encouraged by these agencies as the preferred environmental alternative in many cases. Next. So I'm going to basically do a little storytelling about what has gone on here in North Carolina and how we've gotten to where we are today. This is still a work in progress. We feel like we've had some very good success in dealing with barriers, but we also still have challenges remaining. Next. So our work, particularly promoting living shorelines, really, it's been going on since around 2000. And we followed a number of steps to try to promote these types of strategies, starting with demonstration projects, then encouraging that those projects be evaluated, working on regulatory reforms, both at a federal and state level, working on funding, and then in more recent times, really scaling up projects to much larger scale endeavors that are helping to highlight some new constraints within the existing regulatory systems. Next. The proof of concept projects or demonstration projects that we've done now number in the hundreds, including projects that have been funded through federal dollars that line our coast. Next. just as some examples, this was one of the first, actually the first project that we did back in 2001, and testament to the durability. You know, the project still looks great, even with rising sea levels and intense boat wake energy. It has really worked, and it has had many good outcomes. Next. Up on one of our fresher rivers that's still part of our coastal system. This was a project at a wildlife resources boat ramp. Again, over 20 years old now, and I'm still doing well. Next. And out on Hatteras Island at the community harbor, a project to protect a spit of land that, if it breached, would expose the harbor to the 30 miles of fetch in terms of Pamlico Sound. Again, you know, remarkable results that have provided environmental benefits, but also provided protection for the infrastructure there. Next. So, while seeing is believing, in many cases, having good monitoring and good science to evaluate these projects has been instrumental in terms of regulatory reforms. And our North Carolina Division of Coastal Management did a great service back in 2011 when it undertook an evaluation of many of these marsh projects that have been built to date, and found that they were working and you know, had a positive outcome. Next. And then the scientific community with our universities, as well as the NOAA lab that's located in Beaufort, North Carolina, has done a lot of science on these projects. And again, found, you know, not only did they provide good habitat value, but they also were very resilient in many of the hurricanes that we've had, and performing better than bulkheads. Next. All this work, you know, not only in North Carolina, but the interest in living shorelines around the country caught the attention of the Interagency Coastal Wetlands Working Group back around 2015 or so. And these federal agencies started discussing what more could be done to promote living shoreline projects. And the regulatory barriers came out as one of the major obstacles in having these projects advance and become the go-to way to deal with shoreline stabilization instead of hard bulkheads and other structures that actually degrade the environment. Next. The work of that group actually fostered and led to the Corps of Engineers adopting the first nationwide permit for living shorelines back in 2017. Next. And the work at the federal level really stimulated a better level of confidence and help at the state level, where our state regulatory commission for the coast adopted its own general permit, and the state really pushed working with the federal agencies to actually help the state take the lead in regulating these projects that qualified under the state and federal GPs. So it's really simplified the regulatory review process and sped it up to a matter of weeks rather than years and months. Next. And the nationwide permit that had been adopted by the Corps really had some problems in terms of how it worked in North Carolina. So really, by all the stakeholders coming together and the support from the state agencies, we were able to convince the Wilmington district of the Corps to adopt its own regional permit for living shorelines that was really tailored to the needs and the way permits get reviewed in North Carolina. And that first regional permit was issued in 2019 and has been working in conjunction with the state general permit to permit hundreds of smaller scale projects up to 500 linear feet in length. Next. As these projects have become more in demand, the interest of even lawmakers in our state has been intense. And over the last several years, we've had more than $10 million in direct state appropriations to provide a cost share program to encourage property owners to build these projects, to make sure that they're competitive and really bring in the early adopters to get as many of these projects on the ground as possible. The goal is ultimately to have the market take over, where with ease of permitting and the track record of these projects, that they will become the dominant go-to strategy in terms of shoreline stabilization. Next. So just when we were really feeling good about all this and the money, for infrastructure projects started flowing, we saw demand for larger and larger projects. And these are projects that don't qualify under the general permits. Next. So as we now have moved a number of projects through a more, what we call the major permit review or individual permit review with the Corps, a number of issues are coming back up again that were hotly discussed in the development of the GPs, the general permits. And these are stretching out the permit reviews into some that are taking more than a year. Next. And I'm going to give one example of just what this means to individual projects. This is a project we did with our Department of Transportation near Swansboro, North Carolina. Next. DOT had been listening over the decades and decided that they wanted to try living shorelines to protect many hundreds of miles of coastal highways that are subject to erosion. Next. This particular project is an essential highway link both for everyone as well as our military bases. And so having it disrupted was a no-go, and they had to do something to protect it. Next. It was an expensive project, $2.5 million, but had potential for many environmental benefits. Next. So, DOT typically would have just built a big seawall and protected the highway. But because they were willing to consider this, they actually not only got a special appropriation from our General Assembly, but also National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant to help pay for the project. The permitting took over a year. Next. And this is a picture of the project while it was being constructed. Eventually, all those brown areas between the rocks will be salt marsh that's already been planted, but it will take a while for that to grow in. The original design for this project would have put that marsh sill much further offshore, and we would have had a much larger marsh. And the rock that was necessary along the embankment of the highway would not have been there. It would have been a much more gradual grade coming up to the highway. But particularly because of sort of habitat trade-off concerns as part of the review process and following sort of the traditional way of reviewing these projects, that sill was brought inland, and the marsh component shrunk in terms of the amount of area available. We can debate those trade-offs, but we're projecting a 1.5 foot rise in sea level in the next 30 years here in North Carolina. Loss of salt marshes are going to be one of the key concerns from that sea level rise as marshes get drowned. And this shallow water habitat in this case, which was almost pure sand, it probably isn't going to be in short supply as sea level rises. Next. So we see a real urgent need to really sit down and talk about how to handle these larger projects that have much longer design lives. They're not your typical residential projects, but are more about protecting infrastructure. And the process that was followed to get the general permits for living shorelines was a good one, and it really needs to be replicated to deal with these larger projects and the concerns and obstacles that are being encountered. For beach renourishment projects in the state, there's actually been what's called a programmatic review under NEPA that has really streamlined the review of those projects. So you don't go through the same questions project by project, but you deal with them in a generic sense. So there are mechanisms out there to deal with this. I guess my message in terms of making this occur is that you've got to have the stakeholders involved. You want to bring the science. You want to have everybody at the table. Don't just leave it to an internal agency discussion. And secondly, these things take some time. As you can see, it took nearly 2 decades to work out the general permit process in the state. And with that, I'm done.
All right, Todd, thank you so much for that overview of what's been going on in North Carolina. And again, I want to thank all of our speakers here for the time and effort that they've put into preparing these presentations. So we've got some interesting case studies here to compare. We have had some questions coming in through the Q&A that Diane has been capably answering in writing as we are going. I want to just briefly summarize some of those points for the listening audience, and to remind you, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A box, or you can utilize the chat at this time, and I'll read them out to our presenters. Folks have been asking about the MART program in Washington. Has it been able to address any kind of permitting streamlining? Asking about what is the review capacity, and has it required that they bring on any additional staff? And Diane is responding that they are still very much in the early stages. They have brought in about 14 projects, and permits have been provided to 7 of those. And that while they have not had any regulatory changes, they have found that collaborations and coordination between the agencies and pulling in those applications has really streamlined by eliminating redundancies and really reducing the processing time. And as I think, as we're all aware, that time, as Todd mentioned as well, that time is a huge barrier that landowners are just not interested in dealing with a process that's going to take multiple months. And let's see, a specific question for Todd has just come in. What water depth is needed in North Carolina for oyster reefs to survive?
In our state, we have both subtidal and intertidal oysters, and so pretty much any depth if the other conditions are favorable. Salinity is a big issue, but otherwise, as long as the subtidal oysters, of course, need daily tides or wind tides to survive.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. If we have any additional question about that, I will let you know. Next question is about the term green tape, which Rachel, you had used earlier on. Where did this term come from, and why is the messaging around this so important when you're talking about a report like this?
Thanks, Hillary. I'm not sure I know of the, and sorry about my lighting, of the exact genesis of the term green tape, but it is really intended, to demonstrate that there are regulatory and bureaucratic barriers to enhancing and advancing environmental projects that were originally designed to protect environments and habitats. So that's sort of, it's sort of a corollary to red tape. It is tape, but it is supposed to protect the environment, but in fact, it delays this sort of work. I know that California has initiated the cutting the green tape work. So they passed a law sometime in the late 2010s to sort of initiate a process through kind of multi-sector, multi-stakeholder engagement to also eventually do some policy work. I don't know if that'll be through legislation or otherwise, to advance restoration permitting by cutting the green tape. So essentially streamlining any permitting or enabling coordination between agencies and stakeholders to streamline those processes, which, coastal developers and other industries often have many resources to be able to to coordinate and withstand that sort of regulatory scrutiny that these agencies and nonprofits don't always have.
Thank you. Yeah, I have to, I love the phrase because it's such a visual. It was a shocker to me when I got my first internship in a federal office and actually saw the red tape is an actual thing. Like there's spools of it that they have been using to bind up documents in DC for ages. And that was really eye-opening that like it's an actual thing. Okay, next question. And this actually can go to you as well, Rachel. This report has a lot of great information and they're wondering about next steps. How are you planning to continue sharing this information to encourage policymakers? Where are we going from here?
That is a great question. And I wish I had a really clear answer. You know, I think the nature of research often means that you finish and get a project out the door and then you go on to the next one. So I think like all projects, we haven't had the time to get it out to stakeholders as often as possible. I've been delighted that to have heard from practitioners and researchers across other states that are coastal or the Great Lakes that they want to do a similar analysis for their state to see what's comparable. So I think we'd be really receptive to supporting that sort of work or anything like that. I think that a reasonable next step could be to sort of pull together these bright spots and these highlights, these examples of innovative examples, and try to understand the extent to which the enabling conditions that allowed for these innovations in Washington and North Carolina could be replicated in other states that have either similar or really different policy and political landscapes. But I mean, if others want to move forward on this work, I would love to personally.
Diane, did you want to jump in here? You are on mute. I'm afraid we can't hear you. There we go.
Sure. I think I think just to add to that, I think that, you know, one of the lessons that I've learned through the MART is that there are efficiencies at looking kind of at the whole system, the process, the permitting process system. And it's really difficult to get through you know, federal legislation through, but if you can push, you know, push for that still. But I think the important thing is like maybe, you know, these teams seem to be working well, at least in Washington state. So consider bringing teams of agency representatives together and focusing specifically on coastal restoration.
Rachel or Todd?
If I can quickly jump on to Diane's point, I think, you know, bad news for people who are experiencing the urgency of the crisis, but I couldn't emphasize what Diane said more. All of the bright spots and innovations we found were due to a lot of coordination and collaboration across agencies, across different jurisdictions. And some of those took decades to form before they became really efficient and successful. So, you know, the Chesapeake Bay, Tampa Bay, the Houston Ship Channel, those are all examples of coordinated bodies that have been trying to work together despite competing interests and values, and some alignment on missions and goals for a long time before they got it right. So start now. Sorry, Todd, I didn't mean
That's
to.
good. I was just going to make a comment. Don't forget your friends. I mean, restoration is big business, and there's a lot of economic interests that are very engaged now in these projects, and they can help move the needle too in terms of changing policy. So the good news is a lot of people like restoration projects. I mean, it seems to be, you know, broadly and diversely liked on both sides of the aisle. So.
Very, very good point. And the last question here, what is your advice for other states and entities, especially Florida, about how they can build on this report and on what you've learned here? And Florida was one of your examples, so you might have, or one of your case studies, so you might have something specific to add in there.
Florida's challenging because across the state, there are a lot of different kind of political and policy relationships. So in North Florida, on the Atlantic side, you've got a lot of conflicts with Georgia over water. Then you've got different kind of relationships and situations in the Panhandle. And then in the south of Florida, you've got the Keys and you've got the Everglades. So it's totally different jurisdictions that are overseeing and coordinating on all of these bodies. I think from what I heard in the interviews, more so than I saw in the literature, I think one of the emerging challenges that I heard for Florida that may be relevant for the other states, I don't mean to say it isn't, is the competition between habitats, both in terms of the ways in which mangroves, for example, are encroaching on salt marsh because of climate change, but also the ways in which for permitting, it may be really difficult, for example, to do a restoration project for seagrass that's close to a restoration project for oysters. And so I think if there's going to be any sort of multi-stakeholder engagement process to move forward with streamlined permitting, I would get ahead on these competing and sort of complementary habitat types to make sure that there are enabling conditions to make sure you can kind of move forward with restoration of those simultaneously, and oftentimes kind of next to each other or close enough to each other that you might get some kind of sedimentation effects going both ways. But I'm sure Diane and Todd, as folks on the ground, might have more to say there.
Anyone else want to jump in with advice for Floridians?
Just roll up your sleeves and get to work.
All right. At that, we are at the top of the hour. So again, I want to thank all of our panelists for the wonderful work that you're doing and the time you put into preparing to be with us here today. I think everybody's emails were up on their slides, and you can certainly follow up with us if you have any questions to get in touch. I will remind everyone there are a bunch of links that got dropped into the chat while we were on with the report itself, as well as some other things you can check out for information and websites about the different agencies and reports and so forth we've been talking about here today. Again, I want to thank everyone so much for your time, and we will see you again for our next webinar.
Thanks, everyone.